Welcome to WTO's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WTO's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. Hello. Today, we have brought together 5 very special guests to the Exchange podcast to talk about a topic that hasn't been at the forefront of most of the U.S. trade news in recent months, but has been directly and indirectly impacted by nearly all the trade and tariff developments of the past 234 days. The future of multilateralism and the WTO. We are recording today's episode on Thursday, September 11th at 9 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, the week before the WTO's 2025 public forum in Geneva. So what we talk about today may change by the time you download and listen to today's podcast. It's a thrill to bring together Maria Pagan, the former Deputy United States Trade Representative and U.S. Ambassador to the WTO, who is coming to us from Geneva. Dawn Shackelford, president at Looking Glass Trade LLC and the former assistant USTR for WTO and Multilateral Affairs. Bruce Hirsh, principal at Tailwind Global Strategies, a former deputy assistant USTR for WTO and Multilateral Affairs, among other positions he's held. Ignacio Bercero, senior fellow at Bruegel and a former director for strategy and multilateral affairs at the European Commission. Ignacio was also one of the negotiators of the GATS Uruguay round that created the WTO. And our moderator and discussion host today, Mark Linscott, senior advisor at the Asia Group, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and the former assistant USTR for WTO and multilateral affairs, among other positions he's held. Mark?
Thanks, Ken. Well, it's fantastic to be here with all of you. I know all of you well. I've worked with all of you. My experience has spanned WTO with each of you individually. Bruce and I were in Geneva together in the heyday of the WTO, the first years after it was created. Don and I served together in the Washington office on WTO and multilateral affairs. I've worked with Maria over many years on a variety of WTO issues. But believe it or not, I've known Ignacio the longest. We were apprentice trade negotiators during the safeguard negotiations during the Uruguay round. So it's been roughly, 30 plus years that we've known each other. I've participated in a number of these Friday exchanges with Wendy Cutler and Dan Mullaney and Joe DeMond, and we have covered Trump tariffs. We've covered trade deals, bilateral trade deals. We've covered court cases, but we've only glancingly touched on the WTO, and it's always been in the context of it being, essentially irrelevant in these days, in this most tumultuous period of trade since World War II. Today, however, I'm the moderator, and we're going to focus exclusively on WTO and its relevance for the future. So, I want to refer to an article I think many of us, or most of us, all of us, read by Mike Froman, former USTR, Deputy National Security Advisor in Foreign Affairs in the last couple of weeks. And he noted that clinging to the old system and pining for its restoration would be diluted and futile. I'm using British pronunciation of futile or futile. I'm sorry, the American. So, I think that's a good way to start, to provide us with context. And I want to start with Maria, who among us officially was the most recent in Geneva. So my question to launch this discussion is who or what is to blame for this irrelevance? So, I expect we all agree that it's lacking relevance at this point in time. But there are a number of factors. Is it the U.S. and blocking appellate body appointments, essentially rendering dispute settlement non-operational? Many have referred to this as a primary factor. Is it major developing countries who refuse to belly up to the table during the Doha round, even as it was blowing up, and effectively did that in the Bali and Nairobi ministerial conferences in 2013 and 2015. We have the situation with China and finding ways to undermine the system with its non-transparent, non-market policies and measures, and then other countries responding to that, finding that the WTO was inadequate and essentially going outside the system to respond to China. There's been a longer trend. The propensity of so many countries over 20 plus years to use an exception to the WTO in negotiating free trade agreements, non-MFN, preferential free trade agreements. There may be other existential issues or all of the above. So to get us started, Maria, what's your take on how the WTO has declined in relevance in recent years? And 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been having this conversation. 20 years ago, it was the center of global trade policy.
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and hopefully at some point in time, we can all actually be together at the exchange, at the real exchange, and talk about this over a glass of something. I think to answer your question, I think it's all of the above. I actually, I would note that I think 20 years ago, the United States was already complaining about certain things not going the right way at the WTO. Obviously, things have gotten worse. But what I would say, and I don't entirely disagree with what Ambassador Froman said, with what Mike said, but look at the world around us. The WTO, I think one of the things that I tell people all the time when they say the WTO is broken or the WTO this or the WTO that, the WTO, in a way, is just a building, by the lake. The WTO really is a membership. And look at the world right now. It's pretty messed up. So, we should not be surprised that the WTO is pretty messed up. And I think all the reasons that you have noted have contributed to, this perceived lack of relevancy. I actually would also add another one, which I think is implied in some of the things that you noted, which is the continuing, the insistence by many members to continue thinking about WTO membership in terms of developed and developing. And this dichotomy, I think, really has broken the negotiating function. And again, you alluded to some of this in your elements. And, it is something that is unique to the WTO as an international organization. In other organizations, you do have gradations, graduations, and whatever you want to call it. And I think that it to continue thinking about it that way, it doesn't reflect the real world right now. And, 30 years have passed since the WTO came into being, and the world has changed, countries have changed, and the system hasn't changed with that. So, is it dead? I don't like talking about it that way, because I do think that there's still things that are happening in there that are very relevant and useful and could be improved. Even just, continuing to improve on transparency, which is something that's continued to be, actually, it's even more important now than ever before. So we are still there, and we should use it, at least for the things that can be useful, to help everybody understand, what's happening in the world right now.
Well, Ignacio, I think it's important to get you in early, since you are in the minority. We've got a number of other former grumpy old, not necessarily old, but grumpy former USTR negotiators. What's the European perspective on this, because you've done this for so long. You've been involved with the WTO since the very start, and going back to the GATT even. I mean, what's your take, and what do you think is the broader European take on the relevance of the WTO?
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, Mark. I'm not sure I'm going to be trying to put forward a European Union position. But I mean, in thinking about your question, I thought, why don't we do a thought experiment? Why don't we imagine that in 2008, July, the United States, India, and China have managed to reach an agreement, a compromise, and it would have been possible to conclude the DDA before the big financial crisis. Let's imagine that the United States and the European Union will, at some point in time during the history of WTO dispute settlement, have realized things are not going the way that it should go. Let's try to find a way to establish a compromise, agree on some better ways to increase the accountability of the appellate body. There would have been an agreement in the DSU review, and maybe the appellate body in 2013 would not have decided that SOEs are not public bodies. Let's imagine that those things, two things, would have happened. Now, would that fundamentally have changed the trade policy of the Trump administration? Would the United States not have decided under Trump 1 to block the appellate body? Would Trump 2 not have decided to go for Liberation Day? I'm not sure that the answer is yes. I suspect that probably the policies would have been very similar. And not only in the United States. I mean, let's imagine, would President Xi Jinping have decided not to launch in 2015 Made in China 2025 because of the constraints about what is a public body? Would have decided that not to follow the policy that he decided to follow in 2015. My impression again is that maybe marginally there must have been some adjustments, but not fundamentally a change of policy. And all of this is to say that, I think that the problems that have now resurfaced are to a large extent of a structural nature. They have to do with some difficulties that both China and the United States on their own and in their mutual relationship have to interact with the multilateral trading system. So I think primarily the issues are of a structural nature and would not have been solved simply if we have managed to have the WTO functioning better than it actually did. Now, I still think that the WTO matters a lot, so please don't take me that what I'm saying is anyway trying to say I agree with Mike. I think that the WTO is something that corresponds to a bygone era. But I'm saying it's trying to find a fix that works for the United States, that works for China, and I have not even started talking about India. It's quite complicated. And we should not delude ourselves that it's something that just with making the things in Geneva work a little bit better was going to be solved.
Yeah, I love that kind of thought experiment, going back to 2008, 2008 being a critical moment when there was this kind of make or break. Are we going to actually conclude the Doha round? But that vision assumes that many, at least from a U.S. perspective, many of the major developing countries would have come forward with meaningful market access offers. I mean, going back to a fundamental of the WTO, lowering tariffs to levels that, start to get closer to developed country levels. And, if that had happened, there probably wouldn't be so much traction for the grievances that really fueled the Trump movement on trade, that there's been this unfairness. So I think you get to a central point. But Bruce, I mean, what's your take on all this? And you've talked a lot about the appellate body situation, which Ignacio referred to, reading Jameson Greer's Turnberry piece, it doesn't seem like this administration is interested in any kind of reform of the appellate body system and dispute settlement. It seems to have kind of moved on from that. What's your take?
Well, I mean, before I certainly want to talk about that. It's one of my favorite topics. But I mean, before getting to that, I'd just like to, build on what, Ignacio had just said. And I think it's a really important distinction, frankly, because, we could have all believed that the WTO was functioning better had these kinds of events taken place, including what you just said, Mark, in terms of developing countries stepping up, at that point in time, and that would have made the relevance, the continued relevance of the WTO more apparent. But there's that separate question of whether it could have met the moment right now, and that moment wouldn't have changed to the extent that China's policies weren't changing. They were, we're going to be in this direction, regardless of whether the institution was going to function better. And, Ignacio has a fair point about whether, President Trump, yes, the grievances may have been better addressed, but we can't say for sure that, his hostility to, multilateralism, his love of unilateralism wouldn't have come out anyhow. So you have to almost distinguish between what the institution could have done to make its relevance more obvious, because it's still relevant in some ways, even though not ways that are meeting the moment, and the challenge that it faces right now with dealing with, frankly, outliers, and who are essentially inviting responses that are outliers from everybody else. So yeah, I mean, for example, on the appellate body issue, the United States was obviously very reluctant over the years to go all in and say, okay, no more, as ultimately they did under Trump 1. Had the system not developed the way it had, all of this, I guess, is another way of saying all of what's happening right now would have come as more of a surprise and more of a shock, because the system would have appeared to have been working much better. We can get into the appellate body a lot more, but I think, building off of what Ignacio was saying, I think it's kind of an important point.
Yeah, actually, and this is where I want to bring Don in, because Don, a longtime champion of the multilateral trading system through thick and thin, even during some very hard days, and the last negotiator on the trade facilitation agreement, one of the perhaps the most important achievement of the WTO over the last couple of decades. So, I'm thinking you might have a bit more of a positive take on this, perhaps more.
You know me so well, Mark.
Ignacio.
So actually, I want to
see what you have to say on that.
Okay, so yeah, I think there's an important distinction to make, that when we think of the WTO, there are the three core functions of the WTO. We all know what those are, but those who are not the trade nerds that might be watching this, we have the dispute function, the appellate body, which I'm sure Bruce can talk some more about, and we have the negotiation function, which we can all agree has been extremely challenging, in large part because of this developing country, non-market economy related issues. But I want to set those aside for just a moment and talk about the third pillar of the WTO, which is the implementation of the agreements themselves. The GATT agreements, the WTO agreements that evolved. And so I was ouster for the entire first Trump administration and the first year of the Biden administration. And during that time, I spent a significant amount of my time trying to explain to the political leadership the importance of the day-to-day work of the standing committees of the WTO to implement the agreements of the system and to implement things like MFN and national treatment. But beyond that, I spent about 40% of my time as ouster working on technical barriers to trade. And this continued when I went to the Commerce Department and did WTO there. I still spent about 40% of my time on technical barriers to trade. And for those who don't know what those are, it's when a country uses things like standards, technical regulations, testing requirements as they may be legitimate policy reasons for doing so, but they may also be disguised barriers to trade, or they could be more trade restrictive than necessary. So the WTO is actually quite good at and continues to be. And when I hear from industry, when I still hear from industry, whether it's the agricultural industry, who is a huge utilizer of the SPS committee, and the manufacturers, as well as the tech industry, huge utilizers of the TBT committee, in terms of putting forward their concerns in a coordinated manner with other like-minded countries to try and induce change in other countries' trade regimes to make them more open and more trade facilitated. And we see success in these committees in doing so. As Ignacio knows, we have a long list of issues that we have worked with many other countries on when we have had challenges with the European Union's attempt to ban forever plastics, the PFAS. A number of countries have raised concerns, and the EU, to their credit, has provided some exceptions now after some discussions at the WTO on this. There have been changes to medical device regulations. There have been changes or acceptance of U.S. automotive standards by countries. Most recently, we're discussing this with Colombia. There is so much real stuff going on in the committees, in the day-to-day work of the WTO, that industry, our industry, as well as other industries, actually care about. And it is moving the ball forward because nobody wants to wait years for a panel or an appellate body decision. You want to use the soft power of the WTO to get this done. So I think you have to separate out the challenges of the appellate body and the challenges of the negotiations from the success of some of the things that the institution does do very well and continues to do well. And I would argue that means that the institution's not irrelevant.
So Don, on that point though, TBT, I mean, that is what immediately came to mind to me as well. I mean, that is a really active committee. But isn't it also tied into there being credibility with dispute settlement? I mean, to what percentage of those TBT cases actually get resolved in the committee or through consultations? And if they aren't resolved, what's the fallback? In the past, it was dispute settlement, the threat of dispute settlement. That's no longer a threat. So, and Maria really wants to jump in here. So let's
if I can,
Maria,
because
and Ignacio as well.
I really appreciate the way that Don set it apart, and that we really have to look at the different functions. And as people may not know, but I spent most of my professional career being a lawyer for the U.S. government, and I did litigate in front of the WTO. But as in my last position as ambassador, I mean, I did come to understand and recognize more and more that the over focus on the dispute settlement side, the crown jewel, blah blah blah. Sorry, I just can't stand it. It made it seem like that was the only value of the WTO, and I think that is an incorrect way of looking at it. And I actually did try in my time here in Geneva to also, at the same, if I was going to say, here are the things that are wrong, here are the things that are working well. And Dawn, highlighted some of those, and in particular, the TBT and SPS committees, TFA, trade facilitation. I mean, there are things that go more under the radar that are very valuable. To your question about, okay, but if you can't resolve it in the committee, then what? Well, there are other ways of resolving issues between countries that don't necessarily, mean that you have to go to dispute settlement. And I would say that, if it takes you 20 years to resolve a dispute, through dispute settlement, is that really efficient and effective? And there may be other ways, whether you use the WTO as a framework for resolving it, or you use the fact that we are members of the WTO and we should be playing by these principles or guidelines or obligations, but let's figure out a way of getting a good result. We also need to pay more attention to that. And the other thing I wanted to say is, as we continue these conversations about what happens to the WTO and where do we go, I would caution everybody when we have this conversation to focus on what Trump is doing, because there are, as we have said here, there are a lot of underlying issues and a lot of things that could be fixed in the WTO that have nothing to do with what the Trump administration is doing right now. And if we just focus on what is happening right now in the United States, then we may lose an opportunity to figure out, is there a future? What can we, do with the WTO, and to make it, whatever you want to call it, functional, to work better, et cetera. So again, not trying to say, let's not talk about Trump, but I think that if we just focus on that, then we're gonna, it's gonna be a less useful conversation.
So Ignacio, you clearly have a take on this.
Yeah, no, I know, thanks a lot. I wanted to jump in because I agree with a lot of what Don and Maria have said, but I think I also disagree on one point. And let me just give a little bit my perspective. In my view, the different functions of the WTO, the one which, quite frankly, is probably the less important one is the negotiating function. Of course, it would be great if you could actually negotiate agreements multilaterally to which all the WTO members can subscribe. Very, very difficult these days, but countries have other negotiating options. They can negotiate WTO-compatible free trade agreements. They can negotiate different forms of plurilateral agreements. If they cannot be integrated in the WTO, so be it. You do them and you implement them, even if they are not part formally of the WTO agenda. So the negotiating function is not, for me, the most important thing of the WTO. The most important thing of the WTO, I think the WTO still matters, is because, quite frankly, the rules that were agreed in 1995 were pretty good rules. Now, of course, they are not perfect. If you actually want to look into the rules that you need today, there are certain issues that you have no rules at this point in time, and you need to see how to fill these gaps. There are some areas where the rules are not sufficiently effective, and you would want to improve them. But broadly speaking, these are still pretty good rules that make a lot of sense for countries to follow when they actually develop their trade policy. And what really matters is how many countries really still think that the rules matter. How many countries, if they have a concern, they use the structure of the WTO to raise that concern. That I totally agree with Don and Maria about the importance of the work which is being done in the committees. I still think, quite frankly, that at the end of the day, you have a problem that you cannot solve in the committees, and it's a real significant problem. You try to negotiate, you try to discuss it, but at the end of the day, you need to have a credibly working third-party adjudication. In a way, that's still there for the MPIA countries, not for those which are not part of the MPIA. So for me, dispute settlement is still something which is very much at the core of a rule-based system. So a system with no dispute settlement is not really a rule-based system anymore. But what I think, in my view, one really needs to relativize a bit more is the importance of the negotiating function. Ideally, yes. But for me, quite frankly, the rule-based trading system is not just the WTO. The rule-based trading system is the WTO plus all the different types of rule-based agreements that have been concluded, whether it is FTAs, whether it is plurilaterals, and all of those are the components of the rule-based trading system. And the idea that you can only do things through a multilateral agreement, that was maybe the reality of 1995, but it's not the reality of today, and will never be the reality of the future, in my view.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. The rules-based system is the WTO and its various agreements, but it's more than that. And it's probably important to highlight that virtually every FTA, from CPTPP to USMCA to so many of the ones that the EU has agreed to with bilaterally, et cetera, with many other countries, they use as the foundation the WTO rules. They reaffirm WTO rules. They can, in specific areas like TBT, note that they are, they are TBT plus. They build on those rules. So that's a really important point. But I think there's still this open question about do you need functioning dispute settlement to see those agreements implemented in better ways? But I want to turn briefly to those countries that continue to give lip service to the importance of the multilateral trading system, it being preeminent, or it should be preeminent. It's always the fallback. In virtually every joint statement and various groupings, but in particular, we had just last week or so, in the last 10 days, we had, the meeting in Tianjin in China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. For the first time, I think it actually made reference to the multilateral trading system in the joint statement. And of course, you've got China and India, highlighting that, without any reference to their role over the years in terms of making it a vibrant system there. I saw that there was a comment from a member of the Indian delegation that, what's really important is to move ahead on public stock holding, which is a third. Yeah, I mean, it's a third rail in the agriculture sector. To special treatment for developing countries. So, these, the likes of China and India say, we support this system. I mean, what's your take? I mean, are they going to save the day for the WTO?
Where's they going to say that,
No.
Mark?
Yeah. Look,
it's what they do and what they don't do that matters. Sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
No. I was just going to say, and this sort of, again, building off of what Ignacio just said about the negotiating function not being, perhaps as important as others because there's other places to negotiate. That's certainly the case. However, in terms of the perception of the WTO as relevant, and in particular, the perception of the WTO as of value to the business community. It was the failure of the negotiating function, which caused business to lose interest. And without that interest, the political support for the WTO, it fell. It fell because, the business community just took for granted that what was there, that what was of value, that, you mentioned the 1995 rules would always be there. And the energy just didn't go to it. But so the function is important, which goes to the question you asked, Mark. And, yes, I mean, it's all well and good for, countries, India, China, to mouth these multilateral pieties as if that's going to make a difference. The real rubber hits the road is when they actually start doing something to show leadership. And in India's case, they could make an extraordinarily swift and rapid contribution to the success of the multilateral trading system and to the perception that the WTO is at least a place to negotiate some things if they were to stop blocking every single decision that's made on any issue whatsoever and hostage take on behalf of its pet issues, public stockholding. Right now, I mean, if they were to back off on blocking these plurilaterals, suddenly everyone would say, okay, the WTO is a place where we can get some things done, even if we can't do everything we need to do. If they were to, stop blocking on fish subsidies, then we could actually have a fish subsidies agreement without the donut hole in the middle of it. So there are plenty of places where India could immediately put its money where its mouth is and actually start contributing to the multilateral system.
I mean, can I just jump in very quickly?
Go ahead, Maria.
One of the conundrums that I perceived and continue to perceive is this, dispute settlement and negotiating. And one of the issues is that you begin any negotiation with how am I going to get exceptions, or how am I going to get out of dispute settlement, right? So this is one of the biggest conundrums, is that, so which one is important? Because if every negotiation is about, okay, I'll agree to this as long as it doesn't apply to me or I don't have to change anything, then you have to take that into account when you think, well, then is dispute settlement really good or a plus or a minus for the system as a whole to move forward? You can have disciplines without dispute settlement, and but if to have dispute settlement on agreements that don't mean anything, which one is better? And the issue of public stock holding, which people get lost, and maybe some of the viewers don't really know about public stock holding. But what is the issue of public stock holding? Is India not wanting to be sued for breaking the rules, right? And that is what the public stock holding debate is all about. is
And I
enlarging
think that's the
capabilities, right? So go ahead,
the
Dawn.
key thing for folks to understand is when India and China and Indonesia and South Africa, there's a long list of these countries that when they do speak on their contributions to the WTO, it is in this frame of, well, how do I get out of the commitments? How do I negotiate the exceptions to the commitments before we even know what the commitments are? And unfortunately, that does not get very well explained in the press when these statements are made. But it is, I think, extremely important for people to understand what these countries are actually advocating when they do speak up on saving the WTO.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And sorry, go ahead, Ignacio.
I would be very interested, Martin, hearing your perspective about India, because you obviously know India better than most of us. I mean, just one word on India. I'm still very, very surprised about the difference between the role that India played during the GATT negotiations, where it was a difficult, and I would argue, a constructive player, and the very negative position that India has taken almost from the very beginning of the creation of the WTO. I'm trying to understand why is that. I think, in my view, that would be extremely interesting because, in my view, yes, even if we were going to solve the issues that the United States has, the issues that China has, the issues that have, it's still going to be the question about how to try to get more constructive engagement from India. Now,
that could be a whole separate podcast.
Yeah.
I think so. But let me just say, China is a little bit more complicated. China is a country which is investing massively in the WTO, which is having a lot of influence in the way that WTO things are being developed. I mean, of course, the fundamental interest of China is to maintain the status quo because they are very happy about the status quo, but they are certainly at the same time a constructive player in all discussions relating to reform, a supporting of plurilateral initiatives in the WTO. It's a very different attitude from the attitude of India. And for me, what is a little bit the frustration is that we have never been able to somehow expose China to its contradictions. Because at the end of the day, there have been a more collective exercise in the WTO to try to push for stronger disciplines on the subsidies, state-owned enterprises, that would have really forced China to react, because China would not have been able to say we are not ready to engage in that kind of discussion. Now, for a number of reasons, on which I don't want to discuss in more detail with Dawn or with Maria, it was never really possible to try to push China a little bit more multilaterally towards its responsibilities.
Well, and related to that, well, first of all, I have this mantra, and Don has had a similar experience. We both worked with India multilaterally, and my mantra is that experience was always terrible. It was awful. We were always on opposite sides of issues, and it was never good. Bilaterally, I found that in fact it was much, much better. I mean, you could have real conversations.
I agree.
And some real give and take. And on both on Bruce's point and your point, India could release, it's always an issue of India releasing the hostage in the multilateral, and India could release a big hostage on plurilaterals, with Bali and Nairobi. When we put the nail in the coffin of the Doha round, the vision going forward was plurilateral agreements inside the WTO. Not all countries would sign up to them, but they could potentially benefit from them. And India put the kibosh on that. And now Ambassador Froman, in his piece refers to open plurilaterals, but outside the system. It could be inside the system, meaning inside the WTO. And Ignacio, you and I, several years ago, we had this debate about doing something on industrial subsidies. And our debate was whether China should be at the table or not at the start. The U.S. perspective being that they're at the table at the start, they'll dumb down the rules immediately. Your perspective being, if China's not at the table at the start, then we'll never get them on board, particularly if we're directing the disciplines towards them. So there is this, on the negotiating side, and it does matter in terms of the viability of the WTO going forward. this idea of negotiating plurilaterals. I mean, is there any prospect for a change there that could give new energy, new mojo to the WTO?
I mean, this has been something that I've never, and I think Ignacio said this, I've never been able to figure out really why, India insists on blocking the plurilaterals. Because their answer sometimes is, well, just go and negotiate it outside. But if it's okay to do it outside from their perspective, why not do them inside where, there's more transparency, there's a possibility, it just could work so much better. And, I come out empty-handed. I don't anyway, as Don said, maybe this is for another podcast, but certainly there is the appetite, for plurilaterals within the WTO by the vast majority of members. I don't know where the Trump administration really is going to be on plurilaterals, but we were fine with them, at least while I was there, up until I was there. I honestly have no idea where this administration would be on that. If anybody knows, please let me know.
Any other perspectives on? And we've all worked on the plurilateral concept in the WTO, which is morphed into the Joint Statement Initiatives approach, and they've been kind of strangled at their birth by India's position in terms of somehow they are illegal under the WTO.
I am relatively optimistic. I mean, at least on this particular issue, on certain respects. I mean, I think that it will be politically somehow difficult for India to continue to block by MC14 the investment facilitation for development agreement, particularly if South Africa is ready to shift its position, which might be ready to do. Of course, India will always try to get something there in return, but all things being considered, I think it will be, in my view, relatively difficult for them to block IFD. E-commerce is much more complicated, although I understand that on e-commerce, probably countries will want to at least stabilize what has been agreed, even if it is not possible to formally integrate it into the WTO. This being said, none of these agreements really deal with the core problem issues that are affecting global trade. I mean, the e-commerce agreement is really very rudimentary, and investment facilitation for development is a good agreement. It's good from development, but again, it doesn't really tackle the core issues which are problematic in terms of the global trading system. Those are level playing field issues, etc., etc. And for those, I suspect that at this point in time, the idea of integrating those agreements in the WTO is not, at least not for the next 3.5 years. Maybe you need to start working on certain issues outside the WTO, if it is not possible to do it in the WTO, to prepare the ground in the future, if possible, if the conditions are there, to integrate it in the WTO. And that's what I see on some of the more challenging issues, like the trade and climate interface, like level playing field issues, where I think it's going to be difficult at this point in time to get an effective DSI process launch in Geneva. So you might need to look into other fora like the UCP-TPP cooperation, open to other countries to participate, like this new Brazilian initiative that they want to present in COP about how to create a new forum to discuss the trade and climate interface. So you may need to be looking into things happening, not in the WTO, but with the idea that eventually, who knows, maybe they could be integrated into the WTO.
So I think it's fine to look at other mechanisms, outside the WTO. But one point I did want to make sure and make is that, in looking at Mike Froman's piece and looking at Jameson Greer's piece, in this idea that we need something new, I think that we need to keep at least the foundational elements of the WTO. And looking at the other agreements that are out there, and as much experience as I've had in the OECD, for example, where you do have this group of the like-minded, the ability to come to agreement, even in the OECD, is extremely challenging. Even on agreement on a an article that's going to be written that most people are not going to read. So the idea that we would come up with some new system of the like-minded to do what the WTO does, I think is unlikely.
Yeah. So, and I think we've been notified by Ken that I think we've pretty much run out of time. And I was going to ask the last question because I think it's very relevant to the point Don raises too. Will the U.S. leave the WTO, or has it effectively already done that? We've got an ambassador that's been nominated, but could the organization survive? Froman referred to rump form without the United States, but I think that's going to have to be for a future discussion before Ken just cuts us off. But
Mark,
go ahead.
Can make one point, even if it gets edited out because we've gone for too long.
Of course.
And that is that it'll be interesting to see whether people really do take the lessons of the current circumstances in terms of how they deal with the WTO. I mean, is India going to ask itself, is this a world without the WTO, which we're basically looking at right now, actually in its interests, or is that a motivator to start contributing? Is there a possibility that even with China, that they will have to ask the question, do we want to bring this back in, and are we willing to accept disciplines? And they're a historical context. Remember in the 1980s, when the United States was engaging in all manner of unilateralism, it was in areas that weren't covered by WTO GATT disciplines. And those disciplines got into the WTO. And they got into the WTO.
But yes.
Yes, but exactly. But I mean, it was precisely because of the sort of chaos that had been taking place in the 80s that they were brought back in. So, I don't know if that's possible this time around, given the nature of the interests involved, especially in China. But in any event, there's at least the possibility that people will get a good hard look at what the world looks like without the WTO and maybe draw some constructive lessons.
So I want to thank all of you. This has been a great discussion, and what is clear to me is that we need to have future discussions on the WTO. It's not irrelevant in terms of our, the Fridays or the WTO's Friday exchanges, but we will have to sign off. So thanks to all of you. This is Mark Linscotty, and thank you for joining us. And we'll see you next week on Friday's Exchange.
Thank you for watching and listening to WTO's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. New episodes drop every Friday, and you'll be the first to know. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with WTO's Friday Exchange.